The major findings of the report is to indicate that the Indian government has by and large failed to live up to its concrete human rights obligations to effectively address the farmer suicide crisis in India. As a result of the fact that 2 decades of economic reforms have also reduced access to rural credit in the country, farmers often are going to private moneylenders who are charging exorbitantly high interest rates from these loans. They take out the loans, they purchase these expensive inputs that are becoming increasingly dominated by multinationals, and they then, on the promises of higher yields and with great hope, plant these seeds hoping that they will result in higher yields and greater financial security for their families. So for some farmers who have access to irrigation and whose farms are well irrigated and who don't have to go to private money lenders to take out loans because they have sufficient capital, certainly they've seen a great deal of higher yields and a lot of success in this area. But for a great number of smallholder farmers who do not have access to irrigation, whose farms are rain-fed, and who have no reserve capital in order to purchase the increasingly expensive inputs, they inevitably go into debt, and because of drought and a lack of access to water, their yields may fail, and then they repeat that cycle for a couple of years, and they end up in insurmountable debt and in a cycle of debt that they simply can't get out of. And as a result, they end up often consuming the very pesticide that they went into debt to purchase to kill themselves. One of the other things to really note in this situation is that for over 2 decades, India has implemented market reforms that have really withdrawn the Indian state from the agricultural sector, resulting in a massive agrarian crisis that these are now symptomatic. The suicides are now symptoms of. One farmer is estimated to commit suicide every 30 minutes in India. And this is based on breaking down the annual statistics that are provided by the Indian government itself, which, as I said earlier, likely grossly underestimate the scope of the problem because a number of individuals are left out of the purview of the count because they're not considered farmers because they don't formally own title to their land. So this may include Dalit farmers, Adivasi farmers, certainly includes female farmers, many of whom don't have property rights but who are farmers nonetheless. That figure, as much of a gross underestimate as it is still quite staggering, and over the past 16 years, it has meant that 250,000 Indian farmers have committed suicide. Those rates are also higher than the general suicide rate in the population, and those rates are also staggering because the very base of farmers in the country is shrinking even as these rates are not. So the rate amongst farmers is actually on the climb, which signals a deepening agrarian crisis. Ultimately, you see these issues having a ripple effect on broader food security issues, on climate change issues, on financial crises. We're no longer at a point that what happens to farmers in one country isn't going to affect price commodities and how food and other commodities are available the world over. Cash crop cultivation and as well as the aggressive push, the multinational sort of push and other push towards monocropping or to pesticide-intensive agriculture also leads to problems with the soil and the ability to harvest the same kind of yield or the same amount of yield over and over again over time. That combined with climate change makes it so that land that has previously been dedicated to food production is either increasingly becoming non-arable or is being shifted over to crops that are not ensuring food security. As a result, and over time, and because of climate change as well, you might see effects in food production moving forward, which affects all of us. The heavy use of certain kinds of pesticides has serious health consequences that have been documented when those pesticides leach into water supplies that can also have a broader effect. And the opening of that door, which India seems to be opening wider and wider now, also has an effect on what you eat and what comes to your table, whether it is genetically modified or not, how it was grown, the inputs that were used to grow it. So ultimately, everything that happens in these industries also ends up affecting what ends up on will affect what ends up on our dinner table, whether it's sufficient quantity, whether it's affordable, and also whether it's safe. So the long-term impacts on Indians in cities and generally can be quite significant, as it can the world over. And more than that, I think this incredible imbalance of wealth and distribution of the benefits of liberalization in India, I think is also going to have longer term, and you already see some of those consequences in terms of stability, in terms of, well, the human rights consequences are severe already, and sustainability. It simply isn't a sustainable model to ignore the human rights of a majority of the population to service the needs and desires and consumer preferences of a very small minority of the population.